My brother spent my $183,000 on the family, and my parents justified it by saying I'd figure out my life. I'm Alex, 32, and for most of my adult life, I believed I was doing the right thing by supporting my family. Now, I see how naive I was. We grew up in a modest household. My parents worked hard but never had much. I got a scholarship to college, graduated at the top of my class, and built a solid career in finance. Within a few years, I was making six figures. My parents were overjoyed, calling me their golden son. They beamed with pride, and I wanted to help them. For 7 years, I sent them $4,500 every month to ensure they lived comfortably. It wasn't an obligation, I did it because I cared. My younger brother Andy, now 28, still lives with my parents. He doesn't work, and they've always made excuses for him, claiming he's finding himself. I never pushed too hard, assuming he'd figure it out eventually. But 2 years ago, I noticed unusual charges on my credit card. I'd given my parents a card for emergencies, but these charges weren't necessities. Designer clothes, high-end electronics, extravagant meals, items far beyond what I'd expect from their modest lifestyle. When I confronted my mom, she brushed it off, saying Andy needed things to help him through a rough time. Feeling guilty, I let it slide. But the charges kept coming, and they only grew more extravagant. 3 months ago, I reached my breaking point and combed through years of credit card statements. What I found floored me. Andy had spent $183,000 over the years, in addition to the $4,500 I was sending monthly. Altogether, they'd taken over $500,000 from me. When I confronted my family, my mom defended Andy, saying, "Family takes care of family." Andy didn't even look up from his phone, muttering, "What's the big deal? You're rich." Their entitlement and lack of remorse were staggering. Furious, I canceled the credit card and told them the monthly payments would stop immediately. My mom cried, accusing me of being selfish, while Andy stormed off. A week later, my bank called to report my parents had tried to open a new credit card in my name. That betrayal shattered any lingering doubts I had. When I confronted them again, my dad admitted they saw me as the family provider. My mom justified their actions, saying I had more than enough. It was clear, they didn't see me as their son anymore, just a source of endless income. I cut them off completely, blocked Andy on everything, and limited my parents to email, which I rarely check. The decision was excruciating, but I knew I had to protect myself. Still, the guilt lingers. I've started therapy to work through the betrayal, but some days it's harder than others. They're my family, and despite everything, I still love them. But after what they've done, I don't know if there's a way to move forward. How do you recover from betrayal this deep? Cutting them off should have been the end of it, but things only got worse. A few weeks later, my bank flagged a $98,000 charge to a jewelry store in New York. I hadn't authorized it. Furious, I froze the account. While investigating, I discovered an additional $85,000 in charges from the past 6 months for luxury hotels, international trips, and lavish meals. My parents and Andy had been living extravagantly while I worked 60-hour weeks to support them. I pieced together the truth by contacting the businesses behind the charges. Many confirmed bookings under Andy's name or my parents' contact information. One hotel reported they'd stayed in a penthouse suite, racking up $122,000 in a week. Confronting them this time, I saw a new side of my family. My mom accused me of being controlling, and Andy dismissed my anger, saying I wasn't struggling, so it didn't matter. The audacity was beyond anything I'd imagined. Days later, I discovered they'd forged my signature to co-sign a $45,000 loan. Filing a police report felt like a betrayal of my own values, but I had no choice, it was fraud. The fallout was immediate. The police contacted my parents, and my mom called me in hysterics, blaming me for tearing the family apart. Andy left a scathing voicemail, spewing insults and placing the blame squarely on me. To top it off, I found out Andy had used some of the stolen money to fly his girlfriend, Chloe, to Europe. Chloe, a 22-year-old Instagram influencer with a penchant for luxury, was another layer of betrayal. My family had spent years taking advantage of me, and when confronted, they showed no remorse. Instead, they painted me as the villain for standing up for myself. Discovering the full extent of my family's spending was like peeling back layers of betrayal I didn't even know existed. They hadn't just drained me financially, they'd flaunted it for the world to see. From five-star hotels to private yacht tours, their once-in-a-lifetime experiences were splashed all over social media, accompanied by glowing captions about living their best lives. Every post felt like a slap in the face. My hard-earned money had funded their fantasy, while I worked 60-hour weeks to keep them comfortable. Desperate for answers, I decided to reach out to Andy's girlfriend, Chloe. Maybe she didn't know the full story. Maybe she'd help me understand. But when I finally spoke to her, I was floored. Chloe was completely unapologetic. She casually mentioned that Andy had told her I was fine with everything, that I was helping him out because he was starting a business. A business? That was the first I'd heard of it. She even admitted that Andy had been telling people I was a millionaire who loved spoiling my family. Hearing that from a stranger shattered me. They hadn't just taken advantage of me, they'd twisted the narrative, painting me as some wealthy benefactor who couldn't wait to throw money their way. That conversation was the final straw. I cut off all contact with my family, filed legal actions to protect myself from further fraud, and hired a lawyer to help clean up the mess they'd made of my finances. But as much as I tried to focus on solutions, the emotional toll was relentless. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was deeply personal. These were the people I trusted most, and they'd seen me as nothing more than a bank account. It left me questioning everything, how I hadn't seen the signs earlier, how I'd let things spiral so far out of control, and most painfully, how I could ever trust myself again. Cutting them off should have been the end of it, but instead, it unearthed more lies. A few weeks later, my bank flagged a $98,000 charge to a high-end jewelry store in New York. I hadn't authorized it, and the account was immediately frozen. Furious, I started investigating and uncovered an additional $85,000 in charges made over the past 6 months. Luxury hotels, international vacations, lavish meals, all while I was still sending them $4,500 every month. They'd been living extravagantly, burning through my money like it was their personal play fund. My stomach churned as I pieced together the truth. Determined to find out exactly what had happened, I contacted the businesses listed in the charges. Many confirmed bookings under Andy's name or with my parents' contact information. One hotel manager even told me they'd stayed in a penthouse suite for a week, racking up $122,000 in charges. I felt sick to my core. I had been breaking my back to support them, believing I was doing the right thing, while they were indulging in the kind of luxury I couldn't even imagine for myself. I confronted my mom first, armed with every receipt and transaction. I skipped any pleasantries and went straight to the point. I demanded to know how $85,000 had been spent on hotels, tours, and meals, and why there was an attempt to charge $98,000 to my account. Her response floored me. She dismissed my anger with an almost casual tone, saying it was all for the family. That line hit me like a slap in the face. I reminded her that the money I sent was meant for their basic living expenses, not luxury vacations. But instead of apologizing, she doubled down, claiming they deserved to treat themselves for once and that Andy was still figuring things out. Her lack of remorse was staggering. I pressed harder, asking how she could justify Andy spending $183,000 on my credit card. He was 28 years old, still living at home, and hadn't worked a day in years. Instead of taking responsibility, she sighed, as if I were the unreasonable one. She told me Andy was my brother and was going through a tough time. She implied I was selfish for not understanding and claimed I should be helping him out because I was so successful. That's when I snapped. The harm wasn't just about the money, it was years of being lied to and used, years of working tirelessly to ensure their comfort, only to discover they had turned my life's work into their playground. They had enabled Andy's laziness and sense of entitlement while making me the bad guy for daring to question it. I decided to confront Andy directly. When he answered the phone, he sounded groggy, like I had woken him up. It was already 1 p.m. I cut straight to the point, asking how he could justify spending $183,000 on designer clothes, electronics, and fine dining. His response was infuriating. He brushed it off, saying I wasn't struggling and that I'd earn it back. He even had the audacity to tell me that family was supposed to help each other, as if that justified his behavior. I couldn't hold back anymore. I told him he had done nothing but leech off me, while I'd worked my whole life to get where I was. His response? He laughed. He laughed like I was overreacting and accused me of being on a high horse, saying nobody cared about my job or money. His arrogance was staggering. I ended the call by telling him I was done. No more money, no more bailouts, no more enabling. He called me selfish and hung up, but I didn't care. I was done playing their game. Later that evening, my dad called. He rarely got involved in these situations, so I thought he might be the voice of reason. I was wrong. He acknowledged the charges, but tried to guilt me into forgiveness, emphasizing that family helps each other. He even mentioned my mom's health, trying to play the pity card. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad, the one I thought might be the responsible adult in this mess, was justifying their actions and minimizing the damage they'd caused. The conversation with my dad was the final confirmation I needed. They weren't just irresponsible, they were actively manipulative. They had no intention of taking accountability for their actions and saw nothing wrong with what they had done. It wasn't just Andy's entitlement or my mom's excuses, it was the complete lack of integrity from all of them. That night, I sat down and made the decision to cut them off for good. It wasn't just about protecting my finances anymore, it was about protecting myself. The turning point came when my dad tried to guilt me into dropping everything. He insisted the stress was too much for my mom, claiming her health was suffering and I should just let it go for her sake. It felt like I was living in an alternate reality. They had betrayed me, stolen from me, and left me to clean up their mess, and now they expected me to feel guilty for standing up for myself. I told him I wasn't backing down. If they wanted to repair the relationship, they needed to take responsibility and pay back what they owed. Until then, I wanted nothing to do with them. That night, I received a barrage of texts from Andy. His messages were full of insults and profanity, accusing me of tearing the family apart and calling me a wannabe big shot who only cared about money. I blocked his number without hesitation. Despite my firm stance, I couldn't shake the feelings of betrayal and loss. How do you move forward when the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally see you as nothing more than a bank account? The breaking point came when I discovered the forged loan documents. My parents had gone so far as to fake my signature to secure a $45,000 loan. It was the final straw. If I let this slide, what would stop them from doing something even more damaging in the future? I contacted my bank and filed an official fraud report. The process was grueling. The bank required proof of my identity, handwriting samples, and detailed explanations for every suspicious charge. Weeks of back and forth followed, but eventually, they ruled in my favor. The forged loan was cancelled, and many fraudulent credit card charges were reversed. While I was relieved to recover a large portion of the stolen funds, the debt had to fall somewhere, and that somewhere was Andy. Since most of the charges were traced to his name or associated accounts, the liability shifted to him. I didn't tell my family immediately. I wanted to see how long it would take for them to realize what had happened. It didn't take long. Less than a week later, Andy called me, furious. He had been contacted by the bank and informed that he was now responsible for repaying the debts. He accused me of throwing him under the bus, ignoring the fact that he had been the one to rack up the charges in the first place. I calmly reminded him that he was the one who had spent the money, not me. His anger escalated, and he shouted that I was the reason the bank was coming after him. When I pointed out that consequences were a direct result of his own actions, he screamed something unintelligible and hung up. Not long after, my mom called. She was crying, but her tone had the sharpness of anger disguised as hurt. She accused me of ruining Andy's life and asked if I even cared about family. That word, family, was losing all meaning. I told her that Andy had ruined his own life by refusing to take responsibility for his actions. She shot back that I could have covered for him, fixed the mess, and avoided dragging the bank into it. I told her it wasn't my job to clean up his messes anymore, or hers. The line went silent for a moment before she said something I'll never forget. "You've changed, Alex. You used to care about us. Now, all you care about is your money." I hung up. There was nothing left to say. In the days that followed, I took the next step, cutting off the $4,500 I had been sending my parents monthly. What I had thought was helping them stay afloat had been wasted on luxury vacations, fine dining, and indulgences they felt entitled to. It wasn't a gift anymore, it was a drain on my life. The payments stopped, and the fallout was immediate. My mom left a series of voicemails, alternating between pleading and scolding. My dad sent a single text saying, "We need to talk." I ignored them both. Then came the messages from extended family. My parents had twisted the narrative, making themselves look like victims. My Aunt Linda called to berate me, claiming I was being cruel and heartless. "They're your parents, Alex," she said. "They gave you everything, and this is how you repay them." I reminded her that my parents hadn't paid for my education or supported me financially. In fact, they had stolen from me. She didn't have much to say after that, but the damage was already done. Word spread quickly, and I became the villain in my family's story. The one person who stood by me was my cousin Sarah. Always the black sheep of the family, she understood what it was like to be on the receiving end of my parents' manipulative tactics. She told me she admired my strength and urged me to stand firm, reminding me that I wasn't alone in seeing through their behavior. Her support was a lifeline in the chaos, but it didn't erase the sense of loss I felt. My family, the people I had worked so hard to support, had turned against me completely. Despite the financial resolution, the emotional wounds ran deep. I had taken every step to protect myself, blocking their access, cutting off their funds, and holding them accountable, but the betrayal lingered. Trust, especially in the people closest to you, isn't easily rebuilt. I knew I had made the right choices, but the cost was far greater than I'd ever anticipated. For a brief moment, I felt a glimmer of validation. My cousin Sarah, the black sheep of the family, confided in me that my parents had always been this way, even with her. "They just hide it better when they think they can get something out of you," she said. Her words were both comforting and unsettling, confirming the dysfunction that had run deep in my family for years. This wasn't just about money, it had always been there. I had just been too blind to see it. Cutting off my parents financially wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about setting boundaries for the first time in my life. Despite this newfound control, the guilt weighed heavily. Some days, I questioned whether I had done the right thing. The hardest moment came when I saw my mom at a family gathering a few weeks later. She avoided me for most of the day, her expression cold and distant. At one point, she pulled me aside, her voice dripping with bitterness. "I hope you're happy, Alex. You've destroyed this family." I didn't respond. What could I say? I had spent years trying to hold the family together, only to realize the foundation was rotten. Maybe it had to fall apart for something better to be built in its place. Therapy helped, as did cutting off contact with Andy, but the wounds were still fresh. Healing felt like an uphill battle, and rebuilding trust, starting with myself, was a slow and uncertain process. Meanwhile, the consequences of my family's actions began catching up with them, spiraling into chaos in ways I hadn't anticipated. The first signs of trouble came when Andy started receiving relentless calls from debt collectors. At first, he brushed them off, thinking they'd go away. But the calls escalated quickly, coming at all hours and targeting not just Andy, but his friends, acquaintances, and even his landlord. I later learned that Andy hadn't just burned through my money, he'd also taken out personal loans he couldn't repay. The harassment took its toll. One evening, Andy called me, his voice shaky with desperation. He begged for my help, saying the debt collectors were threatening to take him to court. I felt no sympathy. I reminded him that these were the consequences of his own choices. When he realized I wouldn't bail him out, he snapped, accusing me of abandoning him and ruining his life. That was the last I heard from him for a while. A few weeks later, I received a text from Sarah. "Did you hear about Andy?" she wrote. "He's being sued." One of the debt collection agencies had followed through, filing a lawsuit against him. True to form, Andy hadn't bothered to hire a lawyer or even show up for the court date. Unsurprisingly, he lost. The judgment was brutal. He was ordered to repay the full amount, plus interest and legal fees. At the same time, my parents were facing their own financial collapse. Without my monthly payments to lean on, they quickly fell behind on their mortgage. Sarah told me they had tried to refinance the house, but their credit was so poor that no bank would touch them. Eventually, they defaulted on the loan, and the bank foreclosed. My childhood home, the place where I had so many memories, was gone. My parents were forced to move into a small apartment in a rough part of town. Sarah helped them move and sent me a picture of their new place. The contrast was stark: mismatched furniture, bare walls, and an air of defeat. My mom, who had always prided herself on her immaculate home, must have been devastated. But I didn't hear it from her directly. She hadn't spoken to me since the day I cut them off. Andy's situation was even worse. After losing the court case, his wages were garnished, leaving him unable to afford his car payments. His car was repossessed, which also meant losing his job as a delivery driver. Without a steady income, he couldn't pay rent and was eventually evicted. The last I heard, he was couch-surfing with friends, but even that didn't last long. Andy had always been the life of the party, but his freeloading tendencies had worn thin with even his most loyal companions. When Andy reached out to me again, his tone was different, less angry, more desperate. "I screwed up," he admitted. "I know I did. But I'm in a really bad place right now. Can't you help me out, just this once?" His words tugged at my heart, but I had learned my lesson. I told him he needed to figure things out on his own. He didn't take it well, accusing me of abandoning him and blaming me for his predicament, as though I had forced him to make those choices. The conversation left me feeling a mix of sadness and relief: sadness because, despite everything, he was still my brother, and relief because I knew I was finally breaking free of the toxic cycle. My parents weren't faring much better. They had to give up their membership at the local country club, a source of pride and social status for years. My mom took a part-time job at a grocery store, something she hadn't done in decades, while my dad, who had retired early thanks to my financial support, struggled to find work due to his age and health issues. Their once busy social circle quickly dwindled as old friends distanced themselves, realizing my parents were no longer financially well off. My mom, once the queen of social events, was now isolated. The same family members who had criticized me for cutting them off were nowhere to be found when my parents needed help. Andy became a cautionary tale among the extended family. Everyone knew about his reckless spending and the lawsuit, and nobody wanted to associate with him. He had burned too many bridges and alienated too many people. The last I heard, he was staying in a shelter and struggling to find a job. With his spotty work history and bad reputation, it was an uphill battle. Watching all of this unfold has been both heartbreaking and vindicating. I never wanted this for them, but I also know they brought it upon themselves. Their choices, their entitlement, and their refusal to take responsibility have left them in a place I can no longer rescue them from. For the first time in years, I feel free, but the cost of that freedom is a family I barely recognize anymore. Watching my family's downward spiral was both heartbreaking and vindicating. Heartbreaking because, no matter how angry I was, they were still my family, and I never wanted to see them suffer like this. Vindicating because it confirmed what I had struggled to accept: I was right to set boundaries. For years, I had been their safety net, their financial cushion, the one who fixed everything when their recklessness caught up with them. The moment I stopped enabling them, their house of cards collapsed. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on everything that's happened. Part of me wonders if I could have done things differently, but another part knows their downfall was inevitable. You can't live recklessly forever without facing the consequences. I've tried to move on, but the guilt creeps in sometimes. I catch myself wondering if I could have saved them from themselves, but then I remind myself, I did everything I could. I gave them more chances than they deserved. At the end of the day, they made their choices, and now they have to live with them. The months after cutting off my family were some of the most challenging yet transformative of my life. For the first time in years, I was free from their expectations and demands. Breaking free from the cycle of guilt and manipulation felt like tearing away at a deeply embedded wound, painful, but necessary. As time passed, I began to see glimpses of the life I could have, one I had worked hard to build but had been too bogged down by their needs to enjoy. One of the first major changes I made was moving to a new home. I had been living in a modest condo in the city for years, partly to avoid flaunting my success in front of my family. My mom's constant remarks, like it must be nice to live somewhere fancy while we're struggling to make ends meet, had kept me in a state of guilt, even as I gave them more than enough. But I was done holding myself back. I started looking for a place that reflected the life I wanted, not the life I felt obligated to settle for. That's when I found it, a beautiful 3-bedroom house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees and far enough from the city to feel like a retreat. It had everything I'd dreamed of, a big backyard, plenty of natural light, and a kitchen perfect for someone like me who loved cooking but never had the time to enjoy it. The move was more emotional than I expected. Packing up my old life felt like shedding a skin, forcing me to confront how much of my identity had been tied to pleasing my family. As I packed, I came across old photos, receipts for extravagant gifts I had bought for them over the years, and even a list I'd made years ago of ways to help my parents retire early. Seeing it all laid out made me realize just how much of myself I had sacrificed for people who never truly appreciated it. On moving day, my cousin Sarah, my rock through this ordeal, came to help. She brought along her husband, Mark, whose light-hearted humor made the chaos of the day bearable. As we unpacked, Sarah handed me a box labeled "Family Stuff." I hesitated before opening it, unsure if I was ready to dive back into that part of my life. Inside were old birthday cards from my parents, photos of Andy and me as kids, and a few trinkets from my childhood home. For a moment, a pang of sadness hit me. But then I closed the box and put it in the attic. I wasn't ready to throw it all away, but I also wasn't going to let it define me anymore. With the move behind me, I turned my focus to setting boundaries. Andy was blocked on everything, but my parents still had my email, which they used sparingly to send passive-aggressive messages about how difficult their lives had become since I abandoned them. I ignored most of them, but one email from my dad caught my eye. In it, he wrote, "We're still your parents and will always love you no matter what, but you've hurt us deeply. Your mother cries every night, wondering why you've turned your back on us. We just want to understand what we did to deserve this." I stared at the screen for a long time, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to explain again why I'd made the choices I did. But I knew it wouldn't matter. They didn't want to understand, they wanted me to feel guilty enough to come back. I deleted the email and set up a filter to send all future messages from them to a separate folder. Out of sight, out of mind. Surprisingly, support came from unexpected places. My coworker Jessica, someone I had always thought of as a casual acquaintance, became one of my biggest cheerleaders. She shared her own story of cutting ties with her family and how she had rebuilt her life. "People like that will drain you dry if you let them," she told me over lunch. "But once you start putting yourself first, it's amazing how much lighter you feel." Her words stuck with me. I started making a conscious effort to focus on myself. For the first time in years, I took up hobbies I had always wanted to try but never found time for. Yoga became a way to reconnect with my body and quiet my mind. I began experimenting with recipes in my new kitchen, cooking elaborate meals just for the joy of it. I even joined a hiking group and discovered a love for the outdoors I never knew I had. Through it all, therapy remained a cornerstone of my healing. My therapist, Dr. Lane, encouraged me to write unsent letters to my family to process my emotions. At first, it felt silly, but as I poured out years of pent-up frustration and sadness, it became cathartic. One day, I wrote a letter to Andy. In it, I told him how much it hurt to see him waste his potential and how angry I was that he had taken advantage of my kindness. But I also told him that, despite everything, I still hoped he could turn his life around. When I finished, I felt a strange sense of peace. I knew I'd never send it, but writing it felt like a step toward closure. The biggest challenge came when my parents tried to involve extended family again. My Aunt Linda called one evening, sharp and accusatory. She demanded to know why I had abandoned my parents. I calmly explained that they had made choices that hurt me deeply and that I had to set boundaries to protect myself. Predictably, she replied, "But they're your parents. Don't you think you owe them something for everything they've done for you?" I felt a surge of anger but kept my voice steady. "No, I don't," I said. "Respect and support go both ways. They've shown me they don't respect me or my boundaries, and I can't keep sacrificing my well-being for people who don't value me." The conversation ended awkwardly, but I felt proud of myself for standing my ground. It was a stark contrast to the person I had been just a year earlier, bending over backward to keep everyone else happy. As time went on, the noise from my family began to fade. Andy was too preoccupied with his own problems to bother me, and my parents seemed to have finally accepted that I wasn't coming back. I still thought about them occasionally, but it no longer consumed me. I had built a life that felt authentic and fulfilling, and for the first time in years, I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me.